Well, Oshan, welcome to the Rite of Passage Fellowship Show. I guess that's what we're going to call this. Um,
Yeah, Price is right.
out of all the fellows, you and I go back the farthest. We were
Yeah,
fraternity brothers, which is just crazy. And
small.
both of us in a world of Elon University that was very different from the intellectual one that we inhabit now.
Hmm.
Welcome, and we'll start talking about your essay in a little while. Why don't you introduce yourself first?
Yeah, yeah. It's a pleasure to be here. It's so funny to see the evolution from. I think we were both had similar experiences at school too, where we kind of we're flailing we were trying to sink our teeth into things. We're having a little trouble finding out how to direct things, and we wound up in interesting places. Um, but yeah, I'm Oshan, out in Kingston. I'm really interested in kind of I have two topics that I really want to explore, both through the essay, but through everything else too. And that's, so there's economics, which is what I was in school for. It's what I majored in. But then there's also kind of the realm of consciousness or contemplative practice or meditation. That was something I grew up with most of my life by virtue of my father. I spent a lot of time in India. Maybe we'll get into that. But I've always been really interested in the conversations that can come from bringing those two spaces together. And I've always felt that there's kind of a lack of that kind of conversation happening. So I was really excited for the opportunity to write the essay because I'm really trying to synthesize a lot of the kind of looking around I've done of how to tie these two, ways of looking at the world into the same kind of conversation. And it was a long process. It was a lot of fun, but I think there's a lot of really interesting possibilities for kind of developing it. So it was really fun to take a stab at it. And yeah,
Yeah, so why don't we start at the end and then work our way back up to the beginning? So,
yeah,
what you're doing here, at least originally, was trying to think of what are the different ways that people are thinking about universal basic income
yeah.
and what are some of the solutions that we like?
Hmm.
What would this cost? You end up coming up with a $3.6 trillion per year number.
Right.
And you look at you're basically trying to say there isn't one way of doing a universal basic income. There are many different ways. And why don't we start there and then get into Hayek and some
Yeah.
of the issues with market structure?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was interesting on the earlier drafts of the essay. I'd kind of structured it to just do a full survey of the entire kind of UBI discourse, and I kind of wound up getting a little more specific. But it's really important, even when I moved towards a little more kind of broader, a little more kind of philosophical analysis. It was really important to keep the pragmatic end because so much talk about basic income is very kind of vague and remains at a high enough level where it's not making a pragmatic, actionable kind of contribution. And it's great to make the case, but I think that we're at the stage in talking about basic income where we need to step into the specifics. Um, and so kind of the broadest way to talk about it is basic income, right? But underneath basic income, you have a couple different directions it can take. There's universal basic income, where everybody gets the same amount, and then you kind of tax people on the back end to adjust the distribution. There's a negative income tax, which is you only give people the specific amount to get them up to a certain income threshold. That way you don't have to tax on the back end. So, and then there's a basic income with a kind of a high end phase out rate where it's a UBI, but you just don't give it to like really rich people. So you just phase it out there. So there's all these different kind of nuanced ways to do it, but they're all forms of basic income. And what's really like one of the most difficult aspects is a negative income tax and a UBI, for example, have the exact same net outcome. So the costs ultimately shouldered by taxpayers are the same in those two proposals, but that's totally counterintuitive because a UBI is a really high gross cost. Like the government has to raise, like you said, around 3.6 trillion and then dish it back out. So that cancels out a lot. But there's a lot of kind of ambiguity about kind of comparing the different ways to implement a basic income. So I wanted to give a little bit of clarity, a little bit of insight into the specifics of policy proposals, but I also wanted to connect those specifics to a kind of broader look at the economic environment and how it kind of relates to the development of subjectivity and consciousness and so on. So I wanted to really bring those two angles together, right? A pragmatic look at how would basic income work? What is the best kind of iteration? And I'm not coming to a big conclusion, but there are certain kind of ways of looking at what are the biggest questions before us right now in terms of making that kind of judgment call. And like I said, keeping that connected to a broader look at the system on the whole.
Yeah, one of the most interesting ideas in this essay that I almost wish that you had explored more, so maybe we can do some digging here together, was not just talking about wealth inequality, where most of the conversation is, oh, these people are so much wealthier than these other people, but something that I've explored a little in terms of how I look at cities, which is time inequality. So if you look at cities, you have more and more wealthier people who are moving into the center of the city. And for example, I was talking to a friend a couple weeks ago, and she said that one of her coworkers commutes 2.5 hours to and from work every day. Whereas in New York, what you find is most of the people I know, hey, I mean, I live in Williamsburg, 2 stops outside of the city of Manhattan, right in the center, in the heart of it all. I remember there was a girl in high school that we were talking about last night. She commuted from a city called Hercules, California into San Francisco, and it took her more than an hour every day. And the problem was, there was an article in the New York Times that the headline was, "The subway is so slow, it's making New Yorkers early." And what the point was that you don't just have to account for the length of the commute, but you have to account for the variance of how long that commute takes. And the reason why these workers were getting there early was because, say that on average, their commute took an hour and a half, but often the commute took 2 hours and 10 minutes. They had to account for 2 hours and 10 minutes. And then on average, they'd get there 40 minutes early. And then what you see is there are strong correlations between commutes and how commutes hurt quality of life. And I think that this gets into this time inequality that I want to explore with you, because I think it's a really good point, and it's something that we're not talking about.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's something that I also want to really dig into, because that's always been kind of, when I look at basic income, that's always been kind of the glimmering piece that stuck out to me. Obviously it's exploding for all kinds of reasons, more generally in response to poverty, or you mentioned inequality, detaching livelihood from labor, all these different things. And these are all very important, and they're very interesting, realms of the debate. But I always thought there's something about the way it changes how we spend our time, or how we can spend our time. It's not anything definite, but it enables possibility. And I've always been looking for kind of the best way to articulate that. And there are 2 things that kind of brought that into focus for me. The first was an article written by Eric Beinhocker and Nick Hanauer. I think it was back in 2014. And it was, I don't remember exactly, but it was something like redefining capitalism or something like that. But yeah, so their idea is to ask, all right, what is wealth, right? Because this question about how do we measure value, what is wealth? This is getting a lot more focus nowadays. And so they kind of take a stab at this, and they're like, all right, we are accumulating a number of solutions to human problems. We're accumulating different ways of meeting our needs at increasingly kind of varied and useful and not so useful dimensions. So that's like one aspect of wealth. But the other aspect is access to those solutions. So there's the solutions we accumulate as a society and the access that we have to these pre-existing solutions. And if you look at the distribution of access across the population, that's where you begin to see this time inequality, right? There are some people who have to spend the majority of their waking hours exchanging and commodifying their time in order to get enough income just to maintain their current condition, just to maintain access to, these solutions to the problems we already have. And then a kind of farther back framework to look at this is going back to Henry George, a political economist in the late 1800s. And I've been going through his book for a second time, and he has a chapter on what he calls the law of human progress. And so he gives another way to kind of find this inequality. So for him, progress is really about, there's a kind of distribution of our time for how much we have to kind of exchange in order to maintain our condition. So maintaining our condition is actually his language. And once we're able to do that, we then get to devote our mental energies and our time to what he calls progressive purposes. But he says the whole thing of progress is decreasing the proportion of our time that has to go towards maintaining our conditions so that we can put more of our time towards improving our condition and exploring and innovating, all these kinds of things. And you're right in that I think this is so important to kind of bring into the conversation today, because this is a really, it makes, I think, one of the most profound differences in the behaviors, the projects, and all of these things that become available on a day-to-day basis, right? It's how much of my time is going towards X and how much can go towards Y. So those two frameworks I thought were really interesting. It's nice to see. But yeah, time inequality, I think it's totally underdeveloped, and there's a lot more kind of, we can attach all kinds of statistics to that, I'm sure. But yeah, I think it's a really important dimension.
Yeah, it's a bit tangential, but this is just so rich with ideas, and I'm excited about this topic, so excuse me going off a bit of a digression here. Yeah. But there's a quote from Alfred Whitehead where he says that civilization expands by the number of functions it can perform without consciously thinking about them. So doing more, thinking about those things less. And it's funny because we think a lot about this in terms of building a business, where a lot of what building a business is, and you were working in a restaurant for a while, and it might actually be similar. A lot of what good process is it basically takes things that would be running in your brain, puts them into a process so that they can be performed well and basically happen in the background, and then you can move on to higher order tasks. And to me, that seems like a kind of progress in the Georgian sense. But when it comes to the inequality, and we're talking about time inequality, I think that where time inequality kind of begins to pair with wealth inequality is, it seems to me that the secret hidden in plain sight of capitalism is that you need to build equity. Like, the people who have equity seem to do so much better than the people who don't. And what I see is, I had always dreamed of, oh my goodness, if I have a job where I make 6 figures, I'm going to be set for life. And then I got into the actual world of living in New York City, being around people who were worth hundreds of millions of dollars at times, and I saw they were putting their money in the stock market. They were starting businesses, and they had ownership in those businesses. They were buying houses that appreciated with tremendous value. And I think that what begins to come together here is, on one hand, I am sympathetic to people who have time inequality or who don't have time, and they're commuting and they're exhausted, and they get home at the end of the day and they're like, oh, I can't do any more work. That was so draining, because you always have to be on. But at the same time, it's really interesting to have that paired with what is the cliche that is true, that you have the world's information in your fingertips. There's never been a better time to create something and monetize those creations. But I think that there's something about the time inequality and the exhaustion of an hourly wage, the exhaustion of many working class positions, the exhaustion of long commutes, that makes it impossible to tap into that wealth and those opportunities.
Well, yeah, and it's true, because on an individual scale, if you kind of look at, the life in front of you, and you want to spend as much of your time doing what you inherently value, right? Whether or not that's remunerated on the market, like how you just laid it out, that's probably the best way to do it. You want to generate wealth that's going to generate dividends. It doesn't require you to exchange your time and to get it. And so the question becomes, like, do we leave it up to this kind of meritocratic system, meritocracy, where some people are going to be able to do that and some people aren't? And what would it mean if we try to democratize that, that foundation for people? And so for George, another way that he describes progress is, he says it has to essentially function as collective ownership of the fruits, so that when civilization makes progress and it comes up with these kind of solutions to human problems, they're not necessarily for sale on the market so much as they get sedimented in a cycle back down into the soil. And so the soil becomes this kind of shared foundation that rises as civilization makes progress. And so for him, like, his notion of equality is very similar to what we would think about as equal access today.
Talk about Alaska. I think that's a really good example.
Yeah. So Alaska has the Alaska Permanent Fund, which is often talked about in terms of UBI because it's essentially a partial UBI. So in 1982, Alaska passed a law where all the oil revenues had about a 25% tax slapped on them, and all the revenues put into a portfolio, and it's managed collectively by the state, and every citizen gets an equal share, and they wind up getting, on average, about $1,500 a year. That's fluctuated over time. And so that's used as a case study to look at how do unconditional cash transfers kind of change the economy? How does inflation respond? How do labor force participation rates respond, and so on? And it's really interesting if you look at the results that have been coming out of there. I mean, first of all, Alaska. So what they did essentially was socialize or nationalize oil. They were like, this is something that belongs to nobody, therefore it belongs to everybody. Therefore, if you're a company who's going to take this oil and sell it, you're excluding other people from using it, so you need to compensate them. You're taking from the commons, and when you take from the commons, you have to compensate. So that's kind of the thinking behind it. It's a social dividend. And it's ironic because Henry George's book, his main thing is to propose a land value tax, where he wants to do the same thing for all land. He thinks land should be commonly owned. If you use it, you're excluding other people, therefore you need to compensate them. But anyway, with Alaska, they've seen two really interesting results that are very relevant to thinking about basic income at a national scale in the U.S. The first is with inflation, right? One of the most common kind of concerns about a basic income is if everyone gets $12,000 a year, aren't landlords just going to raise prices? Aren't stores going to raise prices? And that absorbs the whole thing. Alaska, in 1982, they had a higher inflation rate relative to the rest of the country. And then they passed the permanent fund. And ever since, even today, the relationship has flipped. So now, since they actually have a lower inflation rate than the rest of the country, which is and granted, you don't want to use Alaska as a full model for the whole American economy, but there's been really interesting data bits coming out of that, and it's also really interesting too, how you frame that, because a lot of times if we talk about taking collective ownership of something like oil, it's going to get slapped with, oh, that's socialist, and it kind of gets thrown out the window. But we see how these different, when you get into the pragmatics of something, you can call it ideologically whatever you want, but that's assimilated fine in the capitalist context. Alaska's not threatening to become socialist. So it's really interesting to see how that's coexisted, and it's very popular out there, has a lot of favorable feeling.
So why don't you compare what happened in Alaska to something like the iPhone or something like Tesla? Because you make the case that actually a lot of that technology is the result of publicly funded research and development, and then the public isn't benefiting from this. And I think that there's some good arguments here. Even going back, this was a popular argument after 2008, where the government gave bailouts to big companies, saved them, but then the people who had funded those bailouts through their taxes didn't benefit from, hey, we just bailed you out. Why aren't we getting a share of your increased stock value and your increased revenues now? And I think that that's a really good argument.
Yeah. One of the pithy ways to put it is that we are socializing the risks and privatizing the returns, right? So this is really building off the work of Mariana Mazzucato, and she wrote two books that are really important to this. The first was The Entrepreneurial State, and that's where she goes through the whole history of how publicly funded R&D has played a role in all of these really pivotal technologies to the world as we know them today. So she documents the iPhone, the touchscreen technology. I think she also went through some element of Google's search algorithm. But yeah, the idea is that publicly funded R&D, so taxpayer dollars, you, me, and everybody, have gone to kind of stimulate the initial, which is the riskiest part of this kind of R&D, this kind of innovation. And then since then, right, companies use these technologies. So take the iPhone. So Apple makes however much money off the iPhone. And it's not to say Apple is being incredibly greedy, so on and so forth. It's just plain and simple. If the risk was publicly subsidized, shouldn't a small portion of the returns also be sent back in the same in-kind, which would be as cash? And I think an interesting outgrowth of that way of looking at things is the conversation happening now about data dividends. California has gotten pretty advanced on this, but the basic way to put it is when we're surfing on Facebook, when we're surfing on Netflix, all these kinds of things, we're essentially providing labor for those companies because they're gathering behavioral data that is fed into the machine learning algorithm that they use to construct consumer profiles, and they sell that to companies and so on. So we're essentially contributing value and not getting compensated for it. And so the idea is, shouldn't we get a financial share of the financial value that comes off of the labor that we've provided? And so it's the same way of thinking. Now it's tough because I think of that more as a social dividend than a basic income, because the thing about a basic income is that's very tied to a specific amount, like providing enough to make a certain kind of difference. Whereas if you want to really break down how much of Apple's profits should we be entitled to, or so on and so forth, it's very tough to make that math add up to a basic income unless it's coupled up to a number of other things. And so you have to kind of ask yourself, are you going to include these kind of socializing a bit of the returns, or kind of just kicking the taxpayers back what they invested? Are you going to include that in the kind of basic income discussion? Or are we going to set up some kind of social dividend like Alaska has, where the capital flows are free to fluctuate as the underlying cash does? So as Apple's profits go up, hypothetically, some kind of tax would go up and we get a bigger kick. As they go down, we get less. And so letting that kind of payout rate fluctuate, I think, is really important when we talk about that. So for example, Mazzucato as well, she is kind of hesitant or skeptical of a basic income. But she is very much in favor of, if we socialize the risks, we should get a kick of the returns. So it's an interesting distinction there. But yeah.
And how is this different from just plain old taxes? So I'm going to ask just the really stupid question of, okay, we did R&D. Apple's now one of the wealthiest companies in the world. They pay a ton in taxes. Thank you, Apple. And we use that money to build schools, pay for roads. What's the difference here?
Yeah. So I think there'd be two initial responses. The first would be pushback on the idea that Apple pays a ton of taxes. So if you look at the actual effective corporate tax rates, so the corporate tax rate, I think right now is at 24% or 26, somewhere in there. Effective tax rates are usually between 11 and 15% for most of those companies. And it varies depending on what's written off and so on and so forth. But one big dimension, when you talk about, for example, how can we get a more kind of just outcome in tax revenues in those situations without even having to talk about implementing a new tax or raising revenues? It's just, how do we get the effective tax rates up to the actual stated rate? So there's a lot of kind of movement there. Beyond that, like what kinds of taxes would function as kind of an outgrowth of the logic we've been talking about? I'm not entirely sure. But corporate tax rates are really difficult because they're so dependent on so many other factors, including international tax rates. This is why people like Thomas Piketty and Gabriel Zuckman, who are talking about progressive tax rates, they're saying like none of this makes sense unless the entire world comes together and we do this kind of collaboratively. So it's really tricky when you talk about how do we extract those earnings we're saying we might be entitled to. I know, for example, in the proposal put together by California, it was some kind of small percentage tax that they would have levied on companies like Facebook. So I don't know the specifics of it, but yeah, that's a really complicated question.
Yeah. Do you worry at all that if we instill a universal basic income, $3.6 trillion, average person gets what, $12,000, $13,000, $14,000 a year, not so much that they can live lavishly, enough that they can live decently? Do you worry that then American business and many of the innovators in America will then want to move elsewhere, and that basically what countries are doing is they're competing to provide a good environment for businesses to be built, for new ideas to flourish, and for people to come together? And I was even looking last night, 6 out of the 7 fastest growing states in the United States of America are on the West Coast, right outside of California. And of those states, 60% of the new migrants into them are Californians. New York now is losing people. And my concern is that what will then happen is things get sort of we add more and more and more taxes, but then we reduce the incentive for people to build here, and we get into this Faustian bargain where we make this deal with the devil, where we think that we're winning, and long term what ends up happening is the whole thing leaves. And so rather than being able to redistribute wealth and give that to different people, we don't even have wealth to redistribute in the first place.
Right. Yeah. There's so many fun directions off there. So you're absolutely like, this is a really important question, right? Because like we mentioned the 3.6 trillion number. So that's the gross cost, roughly, of a generous poverty level basic income that gets everybody $12,490 a year, which is the federal poverty line. Where it gets really important, like we mentioned at the beginning, to begin to really explore the nuances between something like UBI and something like a negative income tax, is that in order to pass UBI, so one thing I did in my essay was I included a funding section where I was like, here are 12 taxes. Here are the projected revenues for these taxes, both people who are pretty skeptical of them and the optimists. Here's how much they could raise. Here's how much if you put them together, so on and so forth, to try to give an idea of what it takes to raise $3.6 trillion a year. I mean, that's massive. And a lot of UBI advocacy will try to write that off and kind of marginalize that element by saying, sure, it's a high gross cost, but the net cost, that's what matters. Like, that's the actual expense. But the fact is, with a high gross cost, you need to enact taxes adequate to raise that sum. And so you're right. If we're going to go the direction of UBI, we're talking about like a comprehensive tax overhaul. And especially assuming that it happened in the next few years, it would be happening within an environment that the international tax scene has not quite shifted to the collaborative environment that makes progressive taxation really likely. So this is one of the reasons that in the essay I kind of offer a certain kind of a negative income tax. It's like trying to push this idea of, all right, if a negative income tax and UBI have the same net effects, and there are a couple of really important differences. And in a vacuum, I think I prefer UBI, but a negative income tax, all you have to raise, it only has a single cost, and that cost can range anywhere from 170 billion up until the highest range is about 890 billion for an incredibly generous, low phase-out rate negative income tax. So the political feasibility and the quantity of taxes that are required to pass a negative income tax relative to a UBI, one is much more feasible than the other in political terms. Even if you want to say economically they're equivalent because they have the same net cost. I can imagine the U.S. passing a negative income tax that costs $400 billion. I mean, that can be almost entirely funded by swapping out redundant welfare programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit, temporary assistance for needy families. There are certain things that just would be doubled with a negative income tax that you wouldn't want. So that takes out a lot. And so when you look at the political feasibility, and I agree with you that it's really important to maintain the conditions for innovation, right? This is the dynamism of the economy, so on and so forth, and we don't want to erode that. And that's actually one of the reasons that I gravitate towards things like a basic income in whatever form, because as opposed to the kind of 20th century model of providing direct services, so giving people houses, giving them food, giving them kind of in-kind transfers, basic income and cash kind of maintains the incentives for innovation in those industries more so than having the government determine the benefits does. But I in terms of realism and so on and so forth, I do think that it's really important to begin looking at how close can we bring a negative income tax in terms of its logistics to a basic income, and how much should we consider, what are the sacrifices? What are the trade-offs, right? If we're going to push for UBI, we need a really good reason to be enacting that many taxes as opposed to a negative income tax. So the trade-offs are always on innovation and so on. But yeah, it's important to think about those.
You look a lot at market design and you begin to question the idea that of Friedrich Hayek basically saying that, you know what, we're just going to let markets roam free. And you take issue with that. You begin to say, you know what, we can actually have markets that we design. And I've been thinking a lot about this because I think that there's actually something wrong in our models of the world in terms of we think of top down, and with people like Robert Moses and with most people anti-communist saying, okay, a top-down society will not work anything top down is oppressive. We're not doing this. So we've
Right.
sort of thrown that out of the window. But then what we said is, you know what? We're just going to do bottom up. And we've become religious with bottom up. You know what? It's bottom up. The problems that come from it, you know what? That's just part of the system. It's a tax that we have to pay. The gambling addictions, the opioid addictions, the way that ads just pollute our environment, the way I could not believe it. So this gonna blow your mind, man. I just like such a sad moment in modern life. So one of my favorite artists, she was on Twitter, and she got stuck in Japan and had to make an emergency trip back to Paris. And what she did was she said, I want you guys to help me get money. I need $500. And she said, I'm not going to accept $500 as a donation because you're going to need your money. So I found a platform that you're going to sit down and you're just going to watch ads. And every time that you watch a 30-second ad, I get 1/10 of a cent. And this is how I'm going to pay for my flight back to France.
Wow.
And I couldn't believe it. It was the actual manifestation of what you're saying, of harvesting attention for cash. And to get back to the Hayekian point, it was one of these bottom-up behaviors that's obviously sick. It's obviously disgusting. And it is the sign of a society that, in this way, has just gone off the rails.
Yeah, it's like it's an actual Black Mirror episode. Yeah, so Hayek is interesting. I used to kind of just unreservedly criticize Hayek, and then actually through my podcast, I've been speaking with people. I spoke with Alex Williams, he wrote the book Inventing the Future, Post-Capitalism, and he did his PhD dissertation on Hayek. And we had been speaking, and I'd kind of assumed the context that you get in kind of progressive left circles where you're just going to trash neoliberalism. You're just going to trash Hayek and Milton Friedman. And he set me straight. He was like, hold on a second. Like Hayek, you got to situate him where he was. He was really interesting. So you have to look at Hayek as a response to his time, right? So he's coming out mid-20th century, the kind of high time of the Keynesian welfare state in the US. So you have incredibly kind of top-down visions of how to run the economy, right? Keynes thought essentially the economy was a machine that you could learn and tune perfectly if you got into it deep enough. So Hayek responds to that and wants to flip the whole thing over. And he says, okay, no, the government is this top-down vision. There are all kinds of reasons why that's no good. We need to go the other direction, free markets. So the reason he was so enamored with free markets was because he saw them as technologies to democratize and decentralize the power that he had thought was getting overly concentrated with the government. And so he builds his whole kind of theory of freedom in tandem with free markets. He thinks free markets are the mechanisms that do this. Okay. And so where I kind of try to pick in, like I think his heart was in the right place. But I think he had, like you mentioned, I think he had an inadequate understanding of freedom. I think that and also that's an absurd thing to say about Hayek. I mean, I'm sure I just don't understand him well enough. But coming out of the culture that he did, Hayek equated freedom with what we would call today as negative freedom. So for Hayek, an absence of anyone telling you what to do or forcing you to do something constitutes freedom. As long as no one is forcing you into a decision, you have meaningful freedoms. And today there's kind of, been that discourse has gotten deeper, and we've added to that understanding this idea of positive freedoms. And especially within the context of market societies, the argument is that there are certain resources that are required in order to actualize and actually kind of act upon your capacities, to realize your capacities, that it's not enough to just have an absence of explicit coercion, but there are implicit forces as well. And I think one of the easiest ways I think to point this out today intuitively is, a young black girl born in Flint, Michigan, or the south side of Chicago. Does she have the same kind of equal access, meaningful freedoms as a young white male born in Manhattan to a wealthy family? Right. So there's kind of, and this goes back to George, right? What's that ground that we're all coming in on and kind of operating from? But so since Hayek had this idea that all it takes is the absence of explicit coercion, free markets were the perfect complement to that, right? So anything government did was an intrusion upon that. And again, this is something that Mazzucato's books do a really good job of kind of digging into, is showing how this idea kind of took shape in our minds that government action is intervention. It is always bad, so on and so forth. That has everything to do with this idea that free markets, so they're on a spectrum, right? Here's government action and here's free markets. And one always pulls away from the other. And so what seems to me a better way to understand the interaction between government regulation and kind of market design is that regulations kind of form, and together with social norms, cultural norms, technology, the entire ecology of things going on in an economy, these things form the kind of basis out of which markets arise. Markets are kind of emergent out of their underlying conditions. And so that creates a little more kind of participatory room. It gives us this kind of way in where, okay, if we tinker with this aspect right here, how is that going to change the incentives of the market? How is that going to change the outcomes that cascade from that, so on and so forth? So yeah, I think that understanding Hayek's theory of freedom is really important. Understanding why he was so gung ho about free markets. And if you don't agree with his theory of freedom, if you think there's more to it than just the absence of explicit coercion, then there's more to market design than just pure deregulation.
Yeah. So with Hayek, there's actually a couple ways to look at this, and I am running both arguments through my mind, and I can't see where either of them are wrong. So the first one would be a libertarian argument, saying we never got Hayek. We have had market constraints, and you haven't given us the opportunity to actually let markets work. What you're calling capitalism, what you're calling free markets, isn't capitalist. It isn't free enough. And actually, I think that there's a lot of good arguments to be made there. Yeah. Then there is the other one basically saying, you know what? We have already been designing these markets, and Oshan, we're already in market design. We've been doing this the entire time, and maybe what you're trying to say is we need to make the unconscious conscious and begin to think very deliberately about how we design our markets. But then what Hayek would say is, how can you, you just said it, how can you as a market designer know? The whole point of what Hayek was trying to say is that prices are an information mechanism. Right. Prices contain more knowledge about the world, more knowledge about how we should be allocating resources than any human can. And so my question to you would be, say that, you know what, we're going to do market design. What is the margin at which we actually have to stop there? Because if we take Hayek for his own word, that the individual human mind is limited in its ability to understand the world, then how does that not become some kind of slippery slope into some kind of socialist, communist, centrally planned world that Hayek was totally against?
Right. Yeah, it's funny. I was just watching a debate, Christopher Hitchens, from back in like the 70s. And it was, socialism versus capitalism. And he was on the socialist side. And it was interesting because they, each gave their opening remarks. And kind of halfway through the debate, I think Hitchens' partner was saying, our opponents, the capitalists, keep describing capitalist institutions that have nothing to do with how the world actually works. So that was their critique. And then the capitalists get up there and they say, well, exactly, capitalism has never existed. Like, we have never seen capitalism yet. And you're absolutely right. And so that's an interesting kind of thing to play with. If we do not describe what we have now as capitalism, but a kind of, a distorted mix of all of these half efforts and so on and so forth, where, how do we take that? Where do we go from there? If you want to go on this side of we've never had pure capitalism and we should try it out, that functionally that means eradicating the entire government, so on and so forth. It's a really interesting, actually, kind of corollary to anarchism. But okay, so intuitively, right, that strikes one as kind of like, whoa, wait a second, like we're just going to get rid of everything. And so I think that we can point to a couple dimensions that kind of show the value that government provides that markets, even free markets, fail to. So one of the ways of thinking about this is to point to markets have inevitably tended towards incentivizing short-term horizons and have failed to incentivize long-term investments, especially ones that we would consider as kind of public good, social good, collective good. The environment is the perfect example of this, right? Now, at some point, you might imagine if we had pure capitalism, at some point it would get to such a degree of crisis with the environment that it would recognize it's in its own interest in order to adjust to save it or something like that. But you really don't want to play that game and take it any further than you have to. So one of the roles of government, and again, like this is one of the things that Keynes thought was really important when he was writing about how to use an objectionable capitalism in order to get to a post-scarcity society. Like this was his whole thing. He said the role of government, like, we need to socialize a portion of investment because markets fail to invest in the public good in a way that properly kind of speaks to the capacities and the needs that we have as a society. And I think that's kind of spot on. We can see this, for example, even in the world of finance, right? We can see how unregulated markets kind of tend towards particular short-term outcomes that to the collective notion of value are detrimental, whereas in the short-term individual, you have massive gains. So there's a kind of incentive problem, I think, that I'm not sure how the pure capitalism argument would respond to, although I assume Hayek wrote something about it. I'd be curious. But to me, that's like the gut reaction of kind of to pump the brakes on this idea of full capitalism is markets have already demonstrated their failure to direct investment kind of where we want it to go.
Yeah. I mean, economics already has a language for this with externalities that if you go through basic Econ 101, then what they'll say is we fail to price carbon properly. We
Right.
fail to price all these sorts of things properly. And I think economics understands this, but I'm actually not sure that our understanding of externalities is nuanced enough. And I think this is a really good time to pivot into when we were together in college and you were an econ major, something happened where you felt like the economics discipline was lacking in some place, that it wasn't integrating the experience of human consciousness properly. It wasn't doing certain things, and talk about those. But then let's talk about the intersection. Let's build this bridge from graduating from Elon in 2015 and then going to India. And I want to hear how this essay is really a synthesis of those two experiences.
Yeah. There's things that economics are blind to, and you discover them. So yeah, when I was in college, and so like I said, I'd grown up around the kind of contemplative orientation my whole life. So that was something that I already felt very kind of gripped by. Consciousness always felt to me as kind of the thing, like that's what's going on here. That's the real kind of that's the question that you should be looking at. And I went into economics still thinking that it seemed intuitive to me that the way we organize our societies, which seems to have so much to do with economic incentives, has so much to do with the kinds of subjectivity that develop within that society, that the kind of the spectrum of consciousness. So one of the books I was reading, Ken Wilber wrote, the first book he wrote is called The Spectrum of Consciousness. And so I had this term in my head the whole time. And so it seemed intuitive to me that the economic organization of society has much to do with the spectrum of consciousness within that society, right? So there's a kind of give and take there. But really, like what I was getting at is I was trying to take an economic approach to subjective experience and so on and so forth. So our department and Elon on the whole was not really a kind of heterodox, out there place. It was pretty straight edged.
It was a training ground for bullshit jobs.
Yes. Yeah. Well, definitely. Absolutely. So I spent 4 years, like here was this kid who was trying to talk about, meditation and economics, and the department had no idea what to do with me. So when it got time to write my senior thesis, and I'd just been trying to figure out, like, why are we accepting tastes and preferences, revealed preferences, as why are we not evaluating them? Why do we not have any kind of normative, evaluative dimension to the kinds of preferences, the kinds of tastes the kinds of humans that economic systems produce. Like, shouldn't, as economists, we kind of consider how incentives are functioning and how design is functioning to create these things? But value, value is always price. Price is value. That's the marginal utility theory. And so my senior thesis, the closest I got was trying to write something about happiness economics. So I was trying to write about, and this was like as far as mainstream discourse has gone at the time, was trying to price in subjective experience, essentially. And, it was flailing. They wound up kind of ditching me off to the outgoing department head, who turns out was quite a heterodox guy, but he was ready to retire, So I spent a lot of time just kind of flailing through that stuff. And when I graduated, I thought, all right, I did not find the bridge. It's not here. So I kind of set economics aside. I got a one-way ticket to Asia. And my girlfriend and I spent about a year out there with the explicit intention of just getting really into meditation, getting really into yoga, and getting to really, to take Wilber's term, to explore the spectrum of consciousness. What are all the different ways that it can feel like to be me in any given moment, right? And this is when I say contemplative practice, right? I'm not just talking about meditation. To me, that's anything that is kind of immersing yourself in the novelties of conscious experience. So psychedelics fit into this, conversation fits into this, a certain kind of conversation, social rituals. I spent a week or so at a monastery in Vermont, actually. And every morning at 4 a.m, the first thing we would do is get down and chant, like Tibetan deep throat chanting, for about a half hour. And out of everything I've done in my life, like, that remains one of the most salient kind of altered states of consciousness I've ever been in, is just being like drowning in deep Tibetan throat chants. It was just such an altered state. And so there's this kind of, interest that develops in, there's a lot of different ways this can feel, this whole thing. So I go out to India and I'm doing this whole thing, the meditation trip, rehashing the old 60s pilgrimage. And it's ironic because the first thing we would do when we would go to a new place is we would go to the used bookshops, because there wasn't much to do. We didn't have much internet connection, so we were reading a lot. And the bookstores there, like, the most popular section was always meditation, spirituality, and so on. But the second most popular section almost always was this kind of blend of economics and cultural studies. And these are books that have been left behind by people who have been like coming and traveling for the past 50, 60 years. And I wound up kind of discovering the economists and the kind of critical theorists and the people who were asking the questions that made sense to me, but I didn't know existed. I found these all through all these different used bookstores. I was getting like the Frankfurt School and Critical Theorists, so a bunch of German Marxists in the early 20th century. There were the Situationists in France, Mark Fisher more recently. But there's this whole existing tradition of people who are asking and looking at how capitalism functions to produce certain effects on consciousness, that there's a continuity between the kind of exterior systems we're existing within and the interior experience of subjectivity. And so that was really eye-opening, because at the same time, a lot of these ashrams, and by this point it was like 2016 when I was in India, a lot of these ashrams are mostly white Westerners. And most of us, we all have the economic privileges in our lives to be able to drop out, get a ticket to India and spend some time just sitting there. And it struck me as I was reading these books that we're not sitting here asking, like, how can we democratize these economic privileges that are enabling us to do this kind of thing? Or even, a little more broadly, why aren't we talking about how to structure society in such a way that we don't have to escape from it in order to kind of drop into these larger questions? Why doesn't society kind of help us in that process? And so these questions were kind of simmering with me, and there's a partition between these two spaces. The contemplative circles, the people into consciousness, some of them were venturing into the idea of social activism, and there is a discourse about, we have to overcome capitalist greed, or even explicitly tying kind of consciousness to some kind of post-capitalist project. But that's still, those are just ideological kind of vague words. It's not an actionable, here's what we need to do. And economists too, as I said, they were very hesitant to step towards the kind of subjective outcomes of the design of the economic systems. So there were these two groups who were like, all right, we should all be speaking, we should all be connecting, but we weren't. So when I wound up coming back from India, that was kind of the question that I had with me, is what are the kind of pragmatic implications of contemplative practice. If we recognize that there is a continuity, or that there's no barrier between interior experience and the exterior systems, right? We've been acting as if there's this partition between them, but there is no partition, right? It's totally porous, it's totally permeable. It's a continuous kind of spectrum. So what would it mean if we thought about economic policy in service of, or as a means to kind of nourish and enrich subjective experience? What kind of policies are things that kind of optimize our environments so that the natural outcome of existing within them, the natural outcome of market incentives, so on and so forth, are things that are actually kind of helping to co-create a more robust kind of experience of consciousness and so on. And that's what I've been doing since. It's happening, but it's slowly developing, but I think it's really important.
Yeah, one of the questions that I have, and let's make this one quick and then we'll move on to Graeber, is can you define subjective experience? Because my worry is that it's going to be misinterpreted, and subjective means, as subjective is the opposite of objective. But that's not what you're saying. You're saying subjective is the felt experience of the ineffable, undescribable qualities of what it means to be human. The ones that we all know, the experiences of falling in love, of watching a grandfather pass away, of watching your kids walk and laugh for the first time. These moments that you can write about and you can speak about, but they pale in comparison to the experience of feeling those moments. And we know that they're so real, but words can't actually touch them like a mirage in the desert. Yeah.
Yeah. This is it's like a hot potato. It's the question that you don't want to have to get into, but you have to get into, the differences between subjective experience is kind of my cop out from using the term consciousness, because consciousness too is incredibly vague. So when we talk about consciousness, if you and I, for the first time, I just said that word, you would have some kind of inclination, like that would mean something to you. You're going to project something of your own, conceptual framework onto what that means. And it might not match up just right, but we assume that there's enough continuity between what I'm indicating and what you're kind of receiving that we can have a conversation. That's not always the case, right? In the kind of the contemplative domain, when you talk about consciousness, there's a distinction between awareness and the contents of consciousness. And the easiest way to kind of demonstrate that would be awareness is kind of the overall environment, or the screen, and the contents are the movies that are projected onto the screen, right? So the awareness is always there, or even that the awareness is the movie theater. It's the whole space. It's always there. It's abiding. It's enduring, and the contents kind of arise and fall and so on. And so there's all these different like levels of distinction that you can get into. Subjective experience, it's what I'm describing when, for example, the first time that I took mushrooms, I was standing on a beach, and what was so jarring about that experience is up until that point in my life, I had just taken for granted that what it feels like to be Oshan right now, what it feels like when I look at this lamp next to me, all these kinds of things, I'd always taken for granted that was a particular kind of fixed experience. And what psychedelics do, what meditation does, what it calls intentional practices do, so on, is you kind of introduce wiggle room in that, and you see that there are actually different kind of modes of experience. There are different orientations to the stream of consciousness, so on and so forth. And especially you mentioned the ineffable, right? Where I think we're so accustomed to conflating the stream of consciousness that's always going on in our minds. There's always kind of a narrative dialogue happening, right? And for so long, I figured that's what my mind is. But then you kind of, if you're lucky enough, you get to kind of unsteady that a bit and dig beneath it. And you see that narration is just like one kind of way we have been filtering that. It's been one way we've been expressing it. And so you find there's all of this kind of space inside that I was not aware that was there before. And so when you mention these life experiences, having a child, so on and so forth, these are really powerful. They're really salient. They, like you said, they stand out to us. They have a lot of contrast. And one of the ways I think about that is they wind up kind of bursting through the numbness that arises out of just operating in the default mode all the time. When you're so familiar with the ways that you're processing experience, that it's liberating to just be kind of thrust out of it for a second. So more or less, right? I'm trying to refer to, in an economic context, for example, if you are someone whose entire life is kind of defined by a kind of low-level humming anxiety of not knowing if you're going to meet next week's bills, right? That kind of anxiety is something that seeps its way into the way that you actually process experience. It's like you're wearing a pair of glasses, and the tint, the fade, is always kind of being fed into by all of the different inputs that are going on around you. And so part of the project of the essay is to show or to call attention to economic conditions as just as kind of salient and important inputs to the way that we wind up processing experience as, for example, the more traditional, like if you want to go all the way back to Buddhism, right? Buddhism is talking about, you have attachment, you have craving, you have desire, and these are things that are going on in your mind. And if you kind of do the work and so on and so forth, at least this is the Western Buddhist interpretation that's been individualized. But there's a much broader kind of spectrum of things that are feeding into subjectivity at any given moment. And I think it could do us a lot of good to start including economics in that discussion.
Yeah, it's a great answer. So when it comes to the numbness, I think that when it comes to the consciousness of capitalism, it turns into some kind of numbness. And it's a theory that I've been working through, and it's, in my experience, been a kind of numbness that then becomes anger. And I think that very often there's not one emotion, there's two emotions, where you could think of it like a boiling tea kettle where heat goes into the tea kettle, but then you get the whistle on the back end. And so it's like, I think the first law of thermodynamics, like energy cannot be created or destroyed. So you create numbness in one place, but then you kind of then get the opposite in extreme anger and maybe a depression. And you talk in this essay, you show a chart from a New York Times article that shows the difference in deaths of despair between people who didn't go to college and people who were college grads, presumably as a proxy for their place in the capitalist system. But, right, even among college grads, like when I hang out with our fraternity brothers, what I see almost consistently is a tragic discontent with what they're doing. I was with a friend of ours about 2 months ago, and he works for a big corporation, and he said to me, you know what, our parents, they just wanted us to be successful, but never stopped to ask if we'd actually be happy. And this was somebody who you would look at and you'd say, this guy's crushing it. And he was, all he wanted was to not be in the game that he was playing. I mean, he was beginning to see that he was winning a game that wasn't even worth playing in the first place. And he said, you know what? If I do really well in my job, I get a 12% raise and I rise to a B-level partner 2 months faster. And you know what? If I don't do anything, I get a 10% raise and it's 2 months later. And to watch people just following the track, which not only is it extremely hard to be financially strong following the track, which is a problem, but I think increasingly just dissatisfying. You end up with all these people who are 6 figures in debt, they have 5 degrees, and it gets into what Graeber's saying, where we end up is in this part of the economy that's filled with nihilism, it's filled with numbness, then that numbness becomes anger, and more poignantly to Graeber, people who are doing work that they know is meaningless.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so one of the ways that I like to kind of frame that is that we are always generating exchange value, so this goes all the way back to Karl Marx, right? Marx talks about how the working class is forced to commodify their time, which is to say package up their time and sell it to somebody in exchange for a wage that they can use to get what they need. And this also goes back to when we talked about time inequality, that when we're commodifying our time, what we're doing is engaging in projects and behaviors that have significant exchange value, which in our case generally is money. But the Marx would call it the use value, but there's a partition, a difference between generating exchange value and doing something that's inherently valuable, something that you actually want to do for that thing, as opposed to using it to generate enough exchange value to get something else. Graeber's study is really interesting because one of the reason that I really wanted to include it was because a lot of times we can kind of get cornered in the basic income conversation to frame it as a response to poverty, to say this is something that's going to eradicate poverty. There are way cheaper ways to eradicate poverty than basic income. Maybe not the negative income tax is one good way, but then a UBI, for example. But basic income for me, it's about much more than that. It's about time. And so Graeber's whole thing is he shows all of these comfortably middle-class people who are undergoing what he calls the spiritual violence of modern work. And it's kind of an anthropological kind of shoving in your face that even if we eradicate poverty, like we're still in a problem. There's still something wrong going on here. And the way he phrases it, I really like it. In the introduction, he says something like, I want this book to be an arrow shot to the heart of civilization, to wake us up to the fact that there is something horribly wrong with what we are making ourselves. And that phrase is so important to me, what we are making ourselves, because that's showing like, listen, we are participating in the design of these systems that are then creating us, right? Like you can apply this logic to anything. We create our technologies and they create us. We build our schools and they build us. We build our cities, they build us. We are, especially in the kind of hyper-connected modern world today, we are always kind of creating ourselves. And so Graeber's thing is like, listen, we are doing this. We are waking up every day and recreating capitalism. And so he's trying to show that this is not just about poverty. This is about the ways of living that people are ushered into and the default modes of consciousness that prevail in those kind of structures of work. But we're doing it because very often we need to. It's the only kind of route that is presented. And this is another virtue, I think, of basic income, one of the reasons that we are so kind of corralled into these ways of living that are so obviously spiritually detrimental is that the risk is so high to try something else. If you want to say, I don't dig what society's offering, I'm going to build something else. It takes a very, very certain kind of individual and very often a lot of privilege in order to act upon that. With a basic income, you're kind of putting this floor that I think lowers the threshold for experimental behavior, for exploratory behavior, for innovations at the most fundamental kind of level of how we organize our lives and how we approach this whole, confounding thing of being alive. And again, when I talked about how can we design economic systems that function in partnership with the enrichment of subjective experience so that we don't have to escape, but this is like the point of the system is to enrich our lives. This makes a lot of sense to me is reducing the risk at trying something else, reducing the risk at opting out of exploitative relationships. So for David Graeber, his kind of concluding sentiment is that UBI functions to create a safe word theory of social liberation, that it gives people a safe word. So you can say orange or whatever it is to a boss. You can say orange to that way of living. Now, granted, like you said, it's not like you can just live off your UBI and be comfortable. That's going to be very low. But it reduces that threshold and I think increases the likelihood that we're going to see all kinds of experimental behaviors that in the long term I think would be really healthy.
Oshan, congratulations on your essay.
Pleasure, David. Thank you.